Hi, I'm Frances, and welcome to my channel. This morning, I read the first part of J.D. Salinger's short story, The Inverted Forest, and I said I would have it in two parts. I actually think I'm going to have to put it into three parts because it's quite long. But I also noticed that I made a mistake, and I don't want to misword anything that Salinger says. So there's this beautiful, brilliant line, and I left out the word young. So I'm going to read this line. Um, okay, so the line is brilliant line. It takes a certain amount of genius to touch anybody properly, let alone a mixed up young girl. And when I originally read it, I said mixed up girl. But anyway, it takes a certain amount of genius to touch anybody properly, let alone a mixed up young girl. That is a brilliant line. So I'm in here with my animals. I try to spend time with my animals. And this morning I read the first part in my art room. I'm going to try to finish it up here. Okay, so where we left off was with the line, she listened ecstatically as the music, the Moldo flowed into the room, very sensibly drawing everything in sight. January 9th, 1937 was a sharp, raw day. The Chinese restaurant was 4 blocks from Columbia, not, as Corrine had imagined, around the corner from it. Her cab driver had trouble finding it. It was off Broadway and squeezed between a delicatessen and a hardware store. The driver, sounding tricked and annoyed, kept saying that he didn't know the neighborhood. Finally, Corrine told him to pull over to the curb. She got out and on foot found the restaurant herself. Inside the restaurant, Corrine selected a boothed-in table opposite the door. She sat down, aware that she was probably the only person in the place who hadn't either a textbook or a notebook within reach. She felt conspicuous, mink coatish. Her face ached from the raw January weather. Her table, just vacated by a couple of beefy students, was wet with spilled tea. Although she was 10 minutes early, she began at once to watch the door. She and Ford had not described themselves over the telephone, and all she had to go on was Robert Wayner's Melba Toast remark about poets almost never looking like poets because they would be infringing on the rights of all the chiropodists who are dead ringers for Byronthus, and a badly lighted image in her mind of a small-featured, light-haired little boy. She began unsnapping and snapping the silver catch on her wristwatch band. Finally, she broke the thing. While she was trying to fix it, a man's voice spoke over her head. Corrine? Yes. She pushed her disabled wristwatch into her handbag and quickly extended her hand to a man in a gray overcoat. Ford was suddenly seated and smiling directly at her. She had to look at him squarely now. There wasn't even a glass for her to reach for. Even if Ford had been a cyclop, Corrine probably would have flinched a kind of happy, integrating flinch. Actually, the other extremity was the case. Ford was a man. Only the glasses he wore saved him from gorgeousness. I won't attempt to estimate the head-on effect of his looks on Corrine's unused secret equipment. She was badly rattled, certainly, and immediately had to use her social wits. I almost thought I'd better wear my midi blouse, she said. Ford started to make some comment, but he didn't get a chance. The Chinese waiter, clinging to some greasy, mimeographed menus, was suddenly hanging over him. The waiter knew Ford and immediately made some report to him about a book that had been left at a table the day before. Ford spoke to the waiter at some length, explaining that the book was not his, that it belonged to the other man, and that the other man would be in late. Before the waiter could pass this bit of information along to the boss, Ford ordered lunch for Corrine and himself. Then Ford turned to Corrine, smiling kindly and with real warmth. That certainly was quite a night, he said to Corrine, as though resuming an interrupted discussion of last Saturday night at the Smiths. Whatever happened to that man, your father's secretary, or whatever he was? Mr. Miller? He stole a lot of money from father and went to Mexico. I guess his case is outlawed by now. Ford nodded. And your dog? He asked. He died when I was in college. He was a nice dog. Are you doing anything now, Corinne? Some kind of work, I mean? You were a very rich little girl, weren't you? They began to talk. That is, Corinne began to talk. She told Ford about her job, about Europe, about college, about her father. She suddenly told him all she knew about her lovely, wild mother, who had, in 1912, in full evening dress, climbed over the promenade deck railing of the SS Majestic. She told him about the Detroit boy who had fallen off the running board of her car in Cannes. She told him about her sinus operation. She told him just about everything. Ordinarily, Corinne was not a talker, but nothing could have stopped her that afternoon. She had whole years and even days full of information which suddenly seemed transferable. Apropos, Ford happened to have a high talent for listening. You're not eating, Corinne observed suddenly. You haven't touched your food at all. Yes, I have. I'm listening to you. Corinne's mind jumped happily to something else. A friend of mine, Bobby Wayner, he's my boss at the magazine, told me something yesterday. He said there are two lines in American poetry which regularly blow off the top of his head. That's the way Bobby talks. What are the lines? Whitman's I am the man I suffered, I was there, and one of yours. But I won't say it in front of, I don't know, the chow mein and stuff. But the one about the man on the island inside the other island. Ford nodded. He was quite a nodder, as a matter of fact. It was a defense mechanism, surely, but a nice one. How did you become a poet? Corinne asked, and stopped to qualify her excited question. I don't mean that. How did you get an education? You weren't exactly on the right track when I last saw you. Ford removed his glasses and squinting cleaned them with his pocket handkerchief. No, I wasn't, he agreed. You went to college. What did you do? Work your way through? Corinne pressed innocently. No, I'd already made enough money to go before that. When I was in high school in Florida, I worked for a bookmaker. A bookie? Really? Horse races and all? Dog races. They were at night, and I could go to school during the day. But isn't there a law preventing minors from working for bookies? Ford smiled. I wasn't a minor, Corinne. I didn't go to high school until I was 19. I'm 30 now, and I'm only out of college 3 years. Do you like teaching? He took his time answering. I can't write poetry all day long. When I'm not writing it, I suppose I like to talk about it. Don't you have any other interest? This time he took even more time answering. I don't think so, he said carefully. I used to, but I've lost them. Or used them up, or just got rid of them. I don't know anymore. Not exactly, anyway. Corinne thought she understood and nodded appreciatively, but her mind was still clicking like a lever's. Her next question was entirely uncharacteristic of her, but then it was that kind of afternoon. Have you ever been in love or anything? She asked him, suddenly wanting to know about the women he had known, how many and what kinds. One can guess, however, that she put this question to Ford less inexcusably than it records. Some of her lovely lopsided charm must have come through with it, because Ford responded to the question with a real laugh. He shifted a little in his seat. The booth was both narrow and hard, and replied, No, I've never been in love. But he frowned over his own statement, as though his craftsman's mind suspected itself of oversimplifying or of having bad material to work with. He looked up at Corinne, as though he hoped she was already losing interest in her question. She wasn't. His handsome face frowned again. Then he undoubtedly took a guess at what Corinne really wanted to know, or at what she ought to have wanted to know. Sorry, my dog. At any rate, his mind began to select and juxtapose its own facts. At last, perhaps solely for Corinne's benefit, he began to talk. Ford's voice was not very good. It was overly husky and just missed being monotonous. Corinne, until I was 18, I had never even had a date with a girl, except when I was a child and you invited me to your party. At that time, you brought your dog to show me. You remember that? Corinne nodded. She was very excited. But Ford frowned again. He seemed dissatisfied with the way he was beginning. For a moment, he seemed likely to chuck the whole idea. Probably Corinne's immodestly responsive face helped lead him through his own strange story. Until I was almost 23, he said abruptly, the only books I had read outside school were the Rover Boys and Tom Swift series. The sound of italics was in this sentence, but he was speaking with a subsurface equanimity now, as though things were going quite in the right direction. The only poems I knew, he told Corinne, were the chanting little ballads I'd had to memorize in grade school. When I was in high school, somehow Milton and Shakespeare never quite got over the teacher's desk. He smiled. Anyway, they never got to my aisle. The waiter came and picked up their half-full bowls and plates of chow mein and fried rice. Corinne asked him to leave the tea. I was a grown man a long time before I knew that real poetry even exists, Ford said when the waiter had left. I'd nearly died looking for it. It's a legitimate enough death, incidentally. It'll get you into some kind of cemetery. He smiled at Corinne, not self-consciously, and added, they may write on your tombstone that you fell off a girl's running board in Cannes, for example, or that you climbed over the railing of a transatlantic liner. I'm sure, though, the real cause of death is accurately recorded in more intelligent circles. He interrupted himself. You feel cold, Corinne? He asked solicitously. No. Do you want to hear all this? It's long. Ford nodded. He blew into his hands and then set them on the table. There was a woman, he told Corinne, who used to come to the track every evening in Florida. Woman in her late 60s. She had bright henna hair and wore a lot of makeup. Her face was pretty jaded and all that, but you could tell that she had once been very wonderful looking. He blew into his hands again. Her name was Mrs. Rizzio. She was a widow. She always wore silver foxes, no matter how hot it was. I saved her a lot of money at the track one evening, several $1,000s. She was a heavy, crazy bettor. She was very grateful to me and wanted to do something about it. First, she wanted to send me to her dentist. My mouth was full of gaps in those days. I'd had some dental work done, but not much. When I was 14, some $2 dentist in Racine had pulled nearly all my teeth. But I just thanked her and told her I went to high school during the day and that I hadn't time to go to the dentist. She seemed very disappointed. She sort of wanted me to become a movie actor, I think. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. She had another way of showing her gratitude, Ford said. Are you sure you're not cold, Corinne? Corinne shook her head. He nodded and took what seemed to be an extraordinarily deep breath. Exhaling, he said, she began to push little white slips of paper into my hand every evening when she saw me at the track. She always wrote me in green ink and in a small but very legible handwriting. She printed. The first slip of paper she gave me had William Butler Yeats written at the top of it, and under Yeats' name the title, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. Under the title, the complete poem was written out for me. I didn't think it was a gag. I just thought she was nuts. But I read the poem, he told Corinne, looking at her. I read it under the arc lights. And then, just for the hell of it, I memorized it. I started reciting to myself under my breath while I waited for the first race to start, and suddenly part of the beauty of it caught on. I got very excited. I had to leave the track after the first race. I went straight to a drugstore where I knew they had dictionaries. I wanted to find out what wattles were and what a glade was and what a linnet was. I couldn't wait to know. For the third time, Ford blew into his long hands. Mrs. Rizzio gave me a poem every evening, he said. I memorized and learned all of them. Everything she gave me was fine. I've never really reconciled her taste in poetry with her idea about my going into the movies. Maybe she just approved of money. Anyway, she gave me the best of Coleridge, Yeats, Keats, Wordsmith, Byron, Shelley, some Whitman, a little Eliot. I never once thanked her for the poems, or even told her what they were meaning to me. I was afraid of breaking the spell. The whole thing seemed magic to me. I knew I'd have to take some kind of action before the racing season was all over. I didn't want the poems to stop reaching me because the season was over. I didn't have sense enough to do any investigating in a public library on my own. I could very well have used our high school library for that matter, but somehow I didn't connect our high school library with poetry. I waited till the last evening of the season. Then I asked her where she was getting all the poems. She was very kind. She invited me to her house to see her library. I went along with her that same night. My heart nearly pounded me out of the cab. The day after she showed me her library, I was supposed to tell my boss whether I'd join him in Miami after my graduation from high school. Graduation was only a week away. I made up my mind not to go to Miami. Mrs. Rizzio had told me I could use her library whenever I wanted. She lived in Tallahassee, and I figured I could hitchhike there in less than an hour any time of day, so I quit my job. As soon as I got my high school diploma, I started spending 19 hours a day in Mrs. Rizzio's library, never less. I did that for 2 months until my eyes finally gave out under the strain. I didn't wear glasses in those days, and my eyes are very bad, the left eye particularly. I don't see much of anything out of it. But I kept coming to her library anyway. I was afraid she'd stop letting me use it if she knew I could no longer read the print in her books. So I didn't say anything to her at all about my eyes. For about 3 weeks, I sat in her library from early morning until late at night with a book in front of me, pretending to be reading, in case anyone came into the room. That was how I began to write poetry myself. I began writing 8 or 10 words of my own on a sheet of paper, in very large letters that I could read without any trouble. I did that for over a month, filling a couple of small dime store writing tablets. Then suddenly I quit, for no particular reason. Chiefly, I was saddened by my own ignorance. I think then, too, I was a little afraid I was going blind. There's never just one reason for anything. But anyway, I quit. It happened to be October, so I went to college. His voice now clearly implied that he was either coming to an end or had already reached it. He smiled at Corrine. "You look as though you're still in school, Corrine. Look at your hands." Corrine's hands were folded on the table, classroom style. The point is, he suddenly broke off. Corrine didn't prompt him. He began again at his own convenience. "The point is," he said, looking at Corrine's folded hands, "that for 7.5 years I've had nothing in my life except poetry. And the years before that I had nothing but," he hesitated, "well, discord and malnutrition and, well, the Rover boys." He stopped dead again, and Corrine thought he was going to tell her point blank how his equipment for survival differed from that of other men. But when he spoke again, there still was mostly organized information in his voice. He still was not really using his own poetry for the occasion. "I've never taken a drink in my life," he said very quietly, as though to take the edge of confession off his statement, "and not because my mother was an alcoholic. I've never smoked either. It's just that somebody told me when I was a small boy that drinking and smoking would dull my sense of taste. I thought it would be a good thing to have a perfect, unimpaired sense of taste. I still think that in a way. I can't get past half my childhood dogmas." At this point, Ford sat back rather stiffly in his seat. The little movement was quite unobtrusive, but Corrine caught it. It was the first time he had shown even the slightest need for self-control of any kind. But he continued, easily enough it seemed. "Every time I buy a ticket on a train, I wonder that I have to pay full price. I feel momentarily gypped, when I see an ordinary adult's ticket in my hand. Until I was 15, my mother used to tell conductors I was under 12. Casually, Ford looked at his wristwatch, saying, "I really have to get back, Corrine. It's been very nice seeing you." Corrine cleared her throat. Can you come to my apartment Friday night?" she asked rapidly. "I'm having a few very good friends," she said specifically. "Can you, please?" If he hadn't already seen, Ford saw now that Corrine was in love with him, and he gave her a brief look that is fairly difficult to describe, yet extremely easy to overanalyze. It had in it nothing quite so melodramatic as a naked warning, but surely a strong suggestion of, why don't you try to be very careful, that is, about me and all. The admonition of a man who either is in love with someone or something he doesn't happen to be regarding at the moment, or who suspects himself of having, at some time in his life, either lost or forfeited some natural interior dimension of mysterious importance. Corinne pushed the look away and fumbled in her handbag. I'll give you my address, she said. Please try to come. I mean, if you can. I certainly will, he said. The week Corinne looked forward to seeing Ford again was an unfamiliar, rather awful week in which she nervously, willfully reclassified her whole person, calling her beautiful high-bridged nose too big and her symmetrical tall body big-boned and hideous. She read Ford's poetry constantly. In her lunch hour, she wandered intensely through Brentano's basement, searching literary magazines for poems by or articles about her love. Evenings, she went so far as to get out her dictionary to translate Guide's now well-known essay on Ford. Chanson and Fin, which first appeared rather incongruously in a Harper's Bazaar-ish French magazine called Madame Chic. At 10 o'clock on the evening Ford was expected, Corinne's telephone rang. She had somebody turn down the volume of her phonograph while she listened to Ford apologize for not having arrived. He explained that he was working. I understand, Corinne said. Then immediately, how long do you think you'll be working? I don't know, Corinne. I'm just in the middle of something. Oh, she said. Ford said, how long do you think your party will keep going? It isn't a party, she denied. Well, your friends, how long will they be there? She made her friends stay until 4 a.m, but Ford didn't show up. He did telephone her again, though, at noon the next day. He tried her apartment first, where the maid gave him her office number. Corinne, I'm terribly sorry about last night. I worked all night. That's all right. Can you have dinner with me tonight, Corinne? Yes. At this point, I could very nicely use 2 old Hollywood characteristics. The calendar that gets its days blown off by an unseen electric fan, and the glorious studio tree that burst in about 2 seconds out of the bitterest winter in the lushest early spring. During the next 4 months, Corinne saw Ford at least 3 times a week. Always uptown, always surrounded by the marquee of third-run movie houses, and nearly always over bowls of Chinese food. But she didn't mind. Neither did she especially mind that her evenings with him seldom, if at all, lasted until later than 11, at which hour Ford, who imposed deadlines on himself, felt that he had to go back to work. Sometimes they went to a movie, but usually they stayed in the Chinese restaurant until it closed. She did almost all the talking. If he now talked at any length at all, he talked about poetry or poets. On a couple of rare evenings, he talked whole essays away. One on Rilke, one on Eliot, but nearly all of the time he listened to Corinne, who had her life to talk away. He took her home every evening via subway and crosstown bus, but he came up to her apartment only once. He looked at Corinne's Rodin, which had belonged to Clara Rilke, and he looked at her books. She played 2 records for him on the phonograph. Then he went home. Although Corinne was accustomed to moderate drinking, most of her friends were either middling heavy or downright heavy drinkers. She never ordered even one cocktail in Ford's company, or near it for that matter. She was afraid he might have a sudden, untimely impulse to take her in his arms, perhaps in the shadow of some familiar uptown landmark, a haberdashery, or an optometrist shop, for example, and find her breath repulsive to some degree. When he finally did kiss her, she had inevitably just arrived from an impromptu cocktail party at the office. The kiss happened in the Chinese restaurant. About 10 weeks after they had first met there, Corinne was reading proof on some of her own copy for the magazine, waiting for Ford. He came up to her, kissed her, took off his overcoat, and sat down. It was the average disenchanted kiss of the average disenchanted husband just checked into the living room straight from the office. Corinne, however, was much too happy with it to wonder just when he passed through a period of enchantment. Later, when she gave the incident a little thought, she arrived at the entirely satisfactory conclusion that the evolution of their kisses was going to take place backwards. The same evening he kissed her, she asked him whether he couldn't find time to meet some of her friends. "I have such nice friends," she told him enthusiastically. "They all know your poetry. Some of them even live on it." "Corinne, I don't mix too well." Corinne leaned forward joyfully, remembering something. "That's what Miss Egletinger once yelled about you into my father's thing. Do you remember Miss Egletinger?" Ford nodded unnostalgically. "What would I have to do if I met them?" he asked. "My friends?" said Corinne, but she saw that he was serious. So she wasn't. "Oh, just juggle a couple of Indian clubs, tell them who your favorite movie stars are." But her jokes around Ford never had any follow-through. She reached for his hand across the table. "Darling, you wouldn't have to do anything. These people just want to see you." A thought struck her, fell across her. "You don't realize, do you, what your poetry means to people?" "Yes, I guess I do." But he had hesitated. Anyway, it wasn't Crane's idea of a good answer. She began rather intensely. "Darling, you can't pick up a literary magazine in Brentano's without seeing your name. And that man you introduced me to, the trustee or something, he said he knows 3 people who are writing books about the cowardly morning. One man in England." She ran her fingers through the knuckle grooves of Ford's hand. "Thousands of people are waiting for Wednesday," she said tenderly. Ford's second book of poems was due to come out, she meant by that. He nodded. Something else was on his mind, however. "There won't be any dancing at your party, will there? I can't dance." A week or so later, a table full of Corinne's best friends met Ford at Corinne's apartment. Robert Wayner arrived first. Then came Louise and Elliot Searmeyer, Corinne's sensible Tuckahoe friends. Then came Alice Hepburn, who taught something at Wellesley, or had. Seymour and Frances Hertz, Corinne's intellectual friends, arrived next, in the same elevator load with Jenny and Wesley Fowler, Corinne's badminton friends. At least 5 of these people had read both of Ford's books. The brand new one, Man on a Carousel, had just come out. And at least 3 of the 5 were honestly and permanently excited by Ford's genius. Ford arrived nearly an hour late, and his shyness lasted almost to the dessert course. Then all of a sudden, his guest of honor behavior turned gently perfect. For a full hour, he spoke to and with Robert Wayner and Elliot Searmeyer on Hopkins poetry. He gave Cy Hertz not only the right attitude for Cy's book, then in preparation, on the Wordsworths, but the title and the first 3 chapters, too. He took on, without batting an eyelash, all of Alice Hepburn's strident, suffragette-ish interpretations. He very kindly and uselessly explained to Wesley Fowler why Walt Whitman isn't dirty. Nothing he said or did during the evening even faintly smacked of performance. He simply was a great man whose greatness had been cornered at a dinner party, and who fought his way out, not with theatrical aphorisms or with boorish taciturny, but generously, laboriously with himself. It was a great evening. If not everyone actually knew it, everyone at least felt it. The next day at the magazine office, Crean had an inter-office telephone call from Robert Wayner. As generally happens to people who overload themselves with any one virtue, Wayner's voice over the phone was so full of control that some of it could not help but leak out. "Nice party," he began. "Bobby, you were wonderful," Kareem responded ecstatically. "Everybody was wonderful. Listen, speak to the operator. Find out if I can kiss you." "Nothing doing." Wayner cleared his throat. "Here on a mission for my government." "No kidding." Kareem felt almost sick with affection for Bobby. He was really wonderful. "What government?" she demanded happily. "He doesn't love you, Kareem." "What?" Kareem said. She had heard Wayner perfectly. "He doesn't love you," Wayner courageously repeated. "He isn't even considering loving you." "Shut up," Kareem said. "All right." There was a long pause, but Wayner's voice came in again. It sounded quite far off. "Kareem, I remember a long time ago kissing you in a cab when you first got back from Europe. It was sort of an unfair scotch and soda kiss. Maybe you remember. I bumped your hat. Weiner cleared his throat again, but he put the whole thing through. There was something about the way you raised your arms to straighten your hat, and the way your face looked in the mirror over the driver's photograph. I don't know, the way you looked and all. You're the greatest hat straightener that ever lived. Kareem broke in coldly. What's the point? Nevertheless, Weiner had touched her, probably deeply. None, I guess. Then, yes, there is a point. Of course there's a point. I'm trying to tell you that Ford's long past noticing that you're the greatest hat straightener that ever lived. I mean, a man just can't reach the kind of poetry Ford's reaching and still keep intact the normal male ability to spot a fine hat straightener. You sound rehearsed, Karina interrupted cruelly. Maybe I am. What makes you think? She broke off, started over. I thought poets were supposed to know more about those things than anyone else, defiantly. They do if they feel like writing verse. They don't if they stick to poetry, Weiner said. Listen, Kareem. In both of Ford's books, there's hardly a line of verse. It's nearly all poetry. Do you have any idea what that means? You tell me, Kareem said coldly. All right. It means that he writes under pressure of dead weight beauty. The only kind of men who write that way. You are rehearsed, Kareem cut in. I wasn't going to phone you without having something to say. If I were... Listen, Kareem said, you're implying that he's some kind of psychotic. I won't have it, Bobby. In the first place, it isn't true. He's serene. He's kind. He's gentle. Don't be a fool, Kareem. He's the most gigantic psychotic you'll ever know. He has to be. Don't be a fool. He's standing up to his eyes in psychosis. What makes you think he doesn't like me? Kareem demanded ambiguously. He likes me very much. Sure he does, but he doesn't love you. You said that. Please shut up. But Weiner distinctly ordered, Kareem, don't marry him. Now listen, she was very angry. If he doesn't love me, as you've so gallantly pointed out, my chances of marrying him aren't very hot, are they? Weiner tried to avoid sounding smug, but his text was against him. He'll marry you, he said. Really? Why? Because he just will, that's all. He likes you and he's cold. And he won't be able to think of any reason why he shouldn't, or he'll refuse to think of a reason why he shouldn't. At any rate, he's not cold, Kareem interrupted angrily. Of course he's cold. I don't care how tender you find him or how kind. He's cold. He's cold as ice. That doesn't make any sense. Kareem, please stay out of it. Don't try to find out if it makes any sense. Kareem and Ford were married on April the 20th, 1937, about 4 months after they had met as adults, in the chapel at Columbia. Kareem's matron of honor was Jenny Fowler, and Dr. Funk of the English department stood up for Ford. About 60 of Kareem's friends came to the wedding. Only 2 people besides Funk came expressly to watch Ford get married, his publisher, Rayburn Clapp, and a very tall, very pale man, an instructor of Elizabethan literature at Columbia, who remarked at least 3 times that the flowers bothered his nasal passages. Dr. Funk canceled Ford's lectures for 10 days, insisting that Ford and Kareem take a short honeymoon. They drove to Canada in Kareem's car. They returned to New York to Kareem's apartment on the first Sunday in May. I know nothing at all about their honeymoon. That's a statement, not an apology, I'd like to point out. If I had really needed the facts, I probably could have got them. The Monday morning following their return to New York, Kareem got a letter in the first mail which she considered rather touching. It read as follows. 32 Macready Road, Harkins, Vermont, April 30th, 1937. Dear Mrs. Ford, I saw last week in the Sunday edition of the New York Times that you and Mr. Ford were married, and I am taking the liberty of writing to you, hoping that Columbia will know your home address and forward this letter accordingly. I have read Mr. Ford's new book of poems, Man on a Carousel, and feel that I must somehow ask him for advice. But rather than risk disturbing him at work, I'm writing to you first. I am 20 and a junior at Creedmoor College here in Harkins. My parents are dead, and since early childhood, I have lived with my aunt in what is probably the oldest, largest, and ugliest house in America. To be as brief as possible, I have written some poems that I would very much like Mr. Ford to see, and I am enclosing them. I beg you to show them to him, as I feel I need his advice so badly. I know I haven't the right to ask Mr. Ford to sit down and write me a letter of detailed criticism, but if he could possibly just read or even look through my poems, that would be enough. You see, our spring vacations begin next Friday, and my aunt and I are coming to New York City next Saturday, May the 8th, on the way to attend my cousin's wedding in Newport. I could very easily speak to you on the telephone about the poems. I shall be everlastingly grateful to you both for any kind of guidance. And may I, at this time, wish you both all happiness for your married life? Yours sincerely, Mary Gates Croft. The letter came in a huge manila envelope. Enclosed with it was a heavy sheaf of yellow first draft paper folded into overly compact eighths. Unlike the letter, which had been typewritten, the verses were written in hard lead pencil and were cramped together unprovocatively. The bride scarcely glanced at them. They looked too untidy to go nicely with her morning orange juice. However, she pushed the verses, letter and envelope, the whole business, across the breakfast table toward the groom. If it were said now that Kareem pushed the verses over to Ford because she had been touched by the young sounding appeal of the letter and because she wanted her qualified, brand new husband to meet the appeal, the greatest part of the truth would be told. But the truth in its entirety seldom comes in one big, neat piece. She had another reason. Ford was eating his cornflakes without cream or sugar. Absolutely dry and unsweetened. Corinne wanted a legitimate excuse to make him look up so that she could suggest, preferably in a casual voice, that he try eating his cornflakes with cream and sugar. Darling, she said. The groom looked up politely from his dry cornflakes and his lecture notes. If you have time today, would you read this? Corinne felt like hearing her own voice in the quiet breakfast room. She went into details. It's a letter and some poems from a college girl in Vermont. The letter's sweet. You can see she spent hours and hours writing it. Anyway, if you can possibly decipher her handwriting and can read the verses, you're to make some comment to me. As she looked at her new husband's handsome Monday morning go to work for the first time face, her trend of thought drifted away from her. She reached across the table, stroked his hand, and finished weakly. She's coming to New York and plans to phone me for your criticism. All very complicated. Ford nodded. Be glad to, he said, and stuffed the letter and verses into his jacket pocket. But it was a much too simple and final reply. Corinne wanted to draw him closer, physically and otherwise, to her. She wanted the oblique shafts of breakfast table sunshine to fall on them together, not singly, not one at a time. Wait a minute, darling. Just give me her address for a second. I'll drop her a line and ask her to tea Sunday. All right, fine. Ford handed over the envelope, smiled, and finished his cornflakes. But as late as the following Sunday noon, Ford still hadn't read the verses. Corinne finally rapped on his door. Ray, darling, that girl I wrote to is coming here in a couple of hours, she said gently. Do you think you could just glance through her verses, just so you can say a few words to her? Sure, I was just looking at some things here. Where are they? You have them, darling. They're probably still in the coat of the blue suit. I'll get dressed and look at them right away, he said efficiently. But he stayed at his desk working until at 3 o'clock the front doorbell rang. Corinne rushed back to his study. Darling, have you read them? Is she here already? Ford asked incredulously. I'll entertain her. You read. Come out when you're finished. Corinne closed the door hurriedly. Rita, the maid, had already answered the doorbell. How do you do, Miss Croft? Corinne said, all hostess, moving forward toward her guest in the living room. She was addressing a slight, fair-haired girl with a receding chin who might almost have passed for 18 instead of 20. She was hatless and wearing a good gray flannel suit, very new. "It's awfully nice of you to let me come in, Mrs. Ford. Won't you sit down? I'm afraid my husband will be a little late." Both women sat down, Miss Croft saying, "I think I'll recognize him. I saw his picture in Poetry Survey. Wasn't it a wonderful picture? I never saw anyone so handsome." Her voice wasn't giddy, but it had in it all the reputed frankness of youth. She looked at her hostess enthusiastically. Corinne laughed. "I never did either," she said. "How do you like New York, Miss Croft?" Corinne sat with her guest for an hour and a half without an appearance of Ford. Conversation was not difficult, however. On the contrary, Miss Croft seemed to have arrived forewarned of the deadly platitudes usually exchanged between out-of-towners and resident New Yorkers. It seemed she had brought her own fresh dialogue. She confessed to Corinne, to begin with, that she liked New York, but only to live here, not to visit. Corinne was genuinely amused, as had been intended, and began to feel sorry for her guest's little receding chin and to notice that her calves and ankles were really quite nice. "I'm trying," Miss Croft suddenly confided a little glumly, "to persuade my aunt to let me stay on in New York to study. I don't have much hope, though, especially after last night. A drunken man came into the dining room at the hotel." She grinned. "I'm not even allowed to wear lipstick." Corinne leaned forward on an impulse. "Look, would you really like to stay and study?" "More than anything else in the world, I guess." "What about Creedmoor? You'd want to finish there, wouldn't you?" "I could go to Barnard. Then I could study at Columbia in the evening," Miss Croft said readily. "Do you think it would help if I spoke with your aunt? I mean, an older woman?" "I'd be very glad to, if that's what you really want," Corinne offered with characteristic kindness. "Oh, golly, that's awfully nice," said Miss Croft, but she shook her head immediately. "But thanks. I think I'd better fight it out alone for the few more days we're here. You couldn't help anyway. I'm afraid you don't know Aunt Cornelia." She looked down self-consciously at her hands. "I've never really been away from home. I live in a way that—" She broke off with a smile Corinne found extremely winning. "What's the difference? I'm really very grateful to be here at all." Corinne asked quietly, "Where are you staying, dear?" "At the Waldorf. I think we're going back next Sunday." Miss Croft giggled. "Aunt Cornelia doesn't trust the servants with the silver, especially the new cook. She's only been with us 9 years and hasn't really proved herself." Corinne laughed, really laughed. She suddenly disapproved the possibility of this bright, small person going back to Vermont with all, or surely most, of her challenges unmet. "Mary, may I call you Mary?" Corinne began. "Bunny. Nobody calls me Mary." "Bunny. You're perfectly welcome to stay here for a while after your aunt leaves, if she'll let you, really. We have a lovely room that we don't even—" Emotionally, Bunny Croft pressed Corinne's hand. Then she placed both her hands into the side pockets of her suit. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick. "I'll work out something," she said with confidence, and smiled. Apparently, it was not her nature to be hopelessly depressed by adverse circumstances. With considerable tea-table enterprise, she began verbally to conduct Corinne around her home in Vermont, pointing out with mixed affection and abhorrence things that had stood or greenly stretched or lay unrepaired all through her childhood. Aunt Cornelia came into focus, a funny, humorless spinster who evidently was carrying on a private war on many fronts, chiefly against progress and dust and fun. Corinne listened attentively, sometimes laughing out loud, sometimes vicariously oppressed, shaking her head. But it was when the servants began to move through the house that Corinne was most personally moved. As Bunny began to speak tenderly and inclusively of an old butler named Harry, who had built kites for her to sail high above her unquestionably gray childhood, whom she had unqualifiedly loved and depended upon, Corinne was acutely, almost painfully, reminded of Eric, her father's old chauffeur, long dead. So long dead. "And Ernestine!" Bunny exclaimed with great warmth. "Golly, I wish you could meet Ernestine. She's Aunt Cornelia's maid. She's a terrible kleptomaniac," she fondly classified. "Has been ever since I can remember. But when I first came to Aunt Cornelia's, Ernestine was the only one in the house, except Harry, who had any idea that the little girl wasn't just a young, short adult. She giggled. A gleam of real mischief came into her eyes. Her eyes were very pretty, gray-green and quite large. For years, I confessed to all kinds of petty thefts around the house. I still do. Golly! Aunt Cornelia would discharge Ernestine in a minute if she knew about her trouble. She grinned. What did your aunt do? I mean, when you were a child? When you took the blame for Ernestine? Corinne asked, amused and interested in and somewhat envious of the apparent resourcefulness by which her guest, apparently unscathed, had passed through her childhood. What would she do? Bunny shrugged her shoulders, a gesture curiously immature for her age, Corinne thought. Bunny grinned. She wouldn't do much about it. Forbid me use of the library. Ernestine would get the key for me anyway. Or tell me I couldn't ride in the horse show. Something like that. Corinne looked at her wristwatch suddenly. Ray should be here, she apologized. I'm awfully sorry he's late. Sorry? Bunny looked shocked. Golly, Mrs. Ford, to think that he'd find time to see me at all. Self-consciously, she scratched her frail wrist, but asked, has he had a chance to look at my poems? Has he had a chance at all? Has he had time at all? Well, so far as I know, Corinne started to stall, but turned in her chair gratefully as she heard the double doors to the living room open. Ray, finally! Come in, darling. Corinne attended to the introductions. Bunny Croft was visibly flustered. Sit down, darling, the bride addressed the groom. You look a little dragged. Have some tea. Ford sat down on the chair between the two women, pushed it back a little, and immediately asked, have you tried to have published any of these poems you have written, Miss Croft? Have you tried to have published any of these poems you have written, Miss Croft? Involuntarily, Corinne arched her back a little. Her husband's question was ice cold. Well, no, Mr. Ford. I didn't think they were. No, I haven't, Bunny Croft said. May I ask why you sent them to me? Well, golly, Mr. Ford, I don't know. I thought I ought to find out whether I'm any good or not. I don't know. Bunny's eyes flashed Corinne in appeal for help. Darling, have some tea, Corinne suggested, confused. Her husband had not come into the room altogether intact. He had brought his handsome head and probably all of his genius, but where was his kindness? No tea, Corinne, thank you, Ford declined, looking a little naked without his kindness. Corinne handed Bunny Croft a fresh cup of tea and looked at her husband evenly. Are the poems interesting, darling? She asked. How do you mean interesting? Corinne carefully put cream in her own tea. Well, are they lovely? Are your poems lovely, Miss Croft? Ford asked. Well, I hope so, Mr. Ford. No, you don't, Ford contradicted quietly. Don't say that. Ray, Corinne said, upset. What's the matter, darling? But Ford was looking at Bunny Croft. Don't say that, he said to her again. Golly, Mr. Ford, if my poems aren't, well, at all lovely, I don't know what they are. Golly. Bunny Croft flushed and put her hands into her jacket pocket out of sight. Ford abruptly stood up. He looked down at Corinne. I have to go, Corinne. I'll be back in an hour. Go, Corinne said. I promised Dr. Funk I'd drop by if we got back today. It was a lie, however unelaborate. It waylaid deftly any oral response from Corinne. She looked up at her husband and just nodded. Ford turned to Bunny Croft, saying goodbye, and sounding curiously logical. The groom bent over and kissed the bride, who immediately got her voice back. Darling, if you could just give Miss Croft a little constructive criticism that might... Oh, no, Bunny Croft protested. Please, it isn't at all necessary, really. Ford, who had caught a head cold during the drive back from Canada, used his handkerchief. He replaced it, saying slowly, Miss Croft, I've read every one of your poems you sent me. I can't tell you you're a poet because you're not. And I'm not saying that because your language is dissonant, or because your metaphors are either hackneyed or false, or because your few attempts to write simply are so flashy that I have a splitting headache. Those things can happen sometimes. He sat down suddenly as though he had been waiting for hours for a chance to sit down. But you're inventive. he informed his guest without a perceptible note of accusation in his voice. He looked at the carpet, concentrating, and pushed back the hair at his temples with his fingertips. A poet doesn't invent his poetry. He finds it, he said to no one in particular. The place, he added slowly, where Alf the sacred river ran, was found out, not invented. He looked out the window from where he sat. He seemed to look as far out of the room as he could. I can't stand any kind of inventedness, he said. Nothing led away from this statement. He sat still for a moment. Then, as abruptly as he had sat down, he stood up. He took Miss Croft's sheaf of poems out of his jacket pocket and rather anonymously placed them on the tea table, not directly in front of anyone. He then removed his reading glasses, narrowing his eyes as people with extremely bad eyesight usually do when they undress their eyes. He put on his other pair of glasses, his street glasses. Then once more he bent over and kissed his bride goodbye. Ray, darling, Miss Croft is terribly young. Isn't it possible that... Crean, I'm late now, Ford said and stood up straight. Goodbye, he said inclusively. He left the room looking pressed for time. Crean's right and wrong reflexes had been uncomfortably overactive most of her life, and at 4:30 in the afternoon, her husband's walkout, his general behavior toward his guest, his unelaborate but obvious lie, all had to her a very high unacceptableness, whether taken singly or collectively. But around 6 in the evening, one of those connubial accidents happened to her which disable a wife, sometimes for months, from speaking up. She happened to open a closet door, and one of Ford's suit jackets, one she had never seen, fell across her face. Besides having a certain natural olfactory value to her, the jacket had 2 great holes at the elbows. Either hole alone could have pledged her to loving silence. At any rate, when at 7 Ford came home, she had been ready for at least an hour to be the last person in the world to ask him. At any rate, when at 7 Ford came home, she had been ready for at least an hour to be the last person in the world to ask him for an explanation. Not once all evening did Ford himself allude to the afternoon in any way. He was quiet at dinner, but as he was often reflectively quiet, his quietness at dinner wasn't obtrusive, didn't necessarily imply that he was carrying around some new X quantity. After dinner, the Fowlers dropped by, unannounced, and disconcertingly tight, to see the returned newlyweds. They stayed until after midnight. Wesley Fowler incessantly one finger in the keyboard on the piano, and Jenny Fowler obviously postponing a crying jag and smoking handfuls of cigarettes. By the time the Fowlers had pulled out, Crean had half forgotten the afternoon, or had informally convinced herself that there is nothing real about a Sunday afternoon anyway. Monday noon, when Bunny Croft telephoned Crean at the magazine, the call came almost as a surprise. But her second reaction was annoyance. Annoyance with herself for having asked Bunny Croft to, look, why don't you call me at the magazine tomorrow and let's have lunch together? And annoyance with Bunny Croft not only for taking advantage of yesterday's sincere invitation, but for still being in New York. Trying people's loyalty to their husbands, keeping people from running over to Saks Fifth Avenue in their lunch hours. Do you know where the Colony is? Corinne asked Bunny over the telephone, aware that there was something unkind about the question. No, I don't. I can find it, though. Corinne gave directions, but she suddenly didn't like the way her own voice was sounding, and broke in with, do you think your Aunt Cornelia would like to join us? I'd love to meet her. She would, I know, but she's in Poughkeepsie. She's visiting somebody she used to go to Vassar with that has to be fed through tubes or something. Oh, well. Miss Ford, are you sure I'm not inconveniencing you? I mean, I don't want... No, not at all. 1 o'clock then? In the taxi on the way to the Colony, Corinne planned to be perfectly pleasant at lunch, but at the same time to let it be known that once dessert was over, her term of hospitality would naturally expire. Lunch, however, was different from what Corinne had vaguely expected or allowed for. Lunch was nice. Lunch was really quite nice, Corinne had to admit. Lunch was gay. Lunch was really quite gay. On the first martini, Bunny Croft began describing with mixed indifference and penetration two of her young men callers in Harkins, Vermont, one of them a medical student, the other a dramatic student. Both young men sounded extremely young and serious and funny to Corinne, and several times she laughed out loud. And as Bunny's casual, superior dormitory talk kept coming across the table, and as the waiter brought a third round of martinis, Corinne herself began to feel distinctly collegiate. Characteristically, she looked around for something generous to say in repayment. "Let me get you a date while you're here," she offered abruptly. "The magazine staff is full of young men, some of them quite nice and bright. I'm getting tight." Bunny looked on the verge of showing interest in Corinne's offer, but she shook her head. "I don't think so," she said thoughtfully. "I want to go to some lectures while I'm here, and, well, I write a little when I don't have to chase around looking at lamps or something with Aunt Cornelia. Thank you, though." She looked down at her martini glass, then up at Corinne. She removed her hands from the table. "I suppose, if I had any sense," she said uncomfortably, "I'd quit writing altogether. I mean, well, golly, after what Mr. Ford said." Corinne sat up straighter in her seat. "You mustn't feel that way," she ordered uneasily. "Ray has a nasty cold he caught on the drive back from Canada. He's not at all himself. It's all in his chest. He really feels horrible." "Oh, I guess I won't really quit. I mean, not really." Bunny smiled but averted her eyes self-consciously. Corinne gave in to the nearest impulse. "Come to the theater with us tonight. I have to see this play for the magazine. I have a ticket for my husband, and I'm sure I can get another. The show's lovely in places." She saw that Bunny, though attracted to the idea, was going to make the proper gesture under the circumstances. "Do you think Mr. Ford would—" But he broke off awkwardly. "Since yesterday, I've been feeling like, golly, I don't know, like an old crone that goes around with a sack of poison apples." Corinne laughed. "Now stop that. You just come along with us. We'll pick you up at the Waldorf." "Are you sure it's all right?" Bunny asked anxiously. "I mean, I don't have to go." "Of course you have to go." Corinne's voice lowered itself to fill up with love. "Really," she said, "you're very much mistaken. My husband is the kindest man in the world." "I'd love to come," Bunny responded simply. "Good. We'll pick you up at the Waldorf. Let's eat. I'm getting tight as a coot. I must say you seem to be able to hold your liquor like an old trooper." "Could I meet you at the theater? I have to see somebody with my aunt at 6. "Certainly, if you like." "Here's a note Corinne sent to me. Bobby, I didn't mean to hold out on you when I came to the big business. It was just that I didn't feel up to talking about it. I've written it down for you, though. I've written it down in the form of a private detective's log, a technique straight out of a freshman English comp I wrote at Wellesley when I thought it might be nice to become a lady detective later on. I got a C+ for the comp, along with an infuriating note from the instructor saying I was quite original but a little precious, and that we don't really tail a scarlet tanager, do we, Miss von Nordhoffen? I'll take the same grade and a similar remark from you, and gladly, in exchange for the comfortable delusion that I couldn't possibly have known, in person I mean, any of the ladies mentioned in the report. Anyway, here it is. Sleep no more. Love, C." On Monday